Hello, I am Tanner.
Hello. All
right, good.
The guy at Bulldog Dash. Check 1, 2, 3. Check.
Sibilance.
Check.
Was that-
Sibilance.
Was that fun?
It was fun.
Okay.
It was fun.
Yes,
That one-
I had a good friend from Poland who was a sound engineer.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I had a check 1, 2. A check 1, 2.
It's pretty good.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hail State Debate, the greatest debate-related channel in the Starkville metropolitan area.
That's right.
We are here for the November-December public forum topic, Resolve. The United States federal government should forgive all federal student loan debt. As always, we want the video to be useful to you, so that's why we have timestamps and links to all the sources in the description below. If it is useful, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe hit the bell, maybe tell a friend. With me, as usual, are Tanner Marlowe and Devin Hutchins, IPDA college debaters extraordinaire. And we've got a ton to cover, gentlemen, so why don't we jump right in with some initial thoughts. Devin, we'll go with you first.
The first thing I thought when researching this topic, or at least reading the topic, was that it was a pretty good one. It kind of moves away from how dense and esoteric the whole Arctic topic was. Nobody knows what that is, and you'll never talk about it, probably for the rest of your lives. But this does matter, and I feel like, you know, for every politically conscious teenager, this is probably at least a little bit salient on your mind. You know what it is, you've thought about it, you've heard about it.
Yeah.
So it's a good direction, but the problem is when you actually research the topic, it's a little bit skewed in favor of the negation and away from the affirmation. You can't make as many good arguments, I think, on the pro. But that being said, I also think, you know, we try to say this every time, and that is to read, and you should definitely read on this topic, because whereas the Arctic was an extremely dense topic, this is dense in its own little way. You need to know a little bit of economic policy and theory, along with just how fiscal policy goes through the government, how we sort of deal with that within our budget and things like that, and kind of what kind of impacts relieving debt is going to have on our economy. So you need to know that, and you need to know the general stuff about this. But the best part about this kind of topic is that this is going to be sort of an off-the-cuff kind of debate. You're going to actually get to, as PF debaters, have a fun, you know, skillful debate where you're not just heaving out evidence at each other. You're actually getting to argue and make good points on your own and give, you know, extemporaneous speeches.
Because it's something you can know about,
Right.
right? And it's because it's something that your judges also know something about.
You don't have to spend so much time explaining or relying on someone else to do the explaining. You yourself can actually argue, and I think that's really important.
Tanner?
Yeah. So first thing when I read this topic was the impacts. Whichever side has the greater amount of impact is really going to win the debate. And when you're talking about the impacts, your judge probably has some sort of interaction with, you know, student loan debt.
Right.
So like relate to them, like talk to them. Like it's one thing to have a really good card of evidence, but it's another thing to relate to your judge on a personal level. So make sure to do that. Make sure to impact them, not just as a judge, but as a person. It's very important. And also too, the next thing I thought is, like they were saying, the topic is hotly debated. So I think it's going to add some dimension to this argument. I think it's going to make you have a fun argumentation, bringing in other information that you might know that is outside of round, which I think is going to be fun with rebuttals and in discussion as well, just to kind of further the idea, or the ideas being furthered in this discussion.
So yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities for both sides to use language that is very sort of real and tangible to the judge. Most of your judges, I would bet, will actually have outstanding student loans, so it matters to them. I'll say I also agree there's a lot of good literature. I don't think it's a really well-balanced topic. Kind of like Devin said. So in IPDA debate, we're an extemporaneous form of debate that we do here at MSU, and what you get is you get like a strike sheet with 5 topics on it, and one of the things we tell our debaters is when you're on the AV or the pro or whatever you want to call it, stay away from like 2 kinds of topics. One is a topic that locks you in as the AV to a very specific policy proposal, and the other is an absolute that uses words like all or best or most. Well, guess what? This topic does both of those to the pro. You are locked into a very specific and very very absolute proposal that we get rid of all student debt. So I don't think it's a particularly well-balanced topic. There are some good pro arguments, but they're just limited in number. They're limited in scope, whereas the con has a lot of very diverse practical objections. They have a lot of good options for counter plans and things like that. So I don't think it's unwinnable for the pro, but I do think the pro has to be very well prepared and very knowledgeable to overcome a wide variety of con arguments. I do think, as everybody else said, it's a real world topic that directly impacts your judges. And what that means, I think, is that you're going to have to talk in terms where it sounds like you know what you're talking about. So like Devin said, on the topic with the Arctic, if you were saying stuff that really didn't make sense in the real world, the only person who's going to spot that would be like an Arctic policy expert. So you had some leeway to come in with kind of outlandish arguments and trust that your judge wouldn't know what they meant. If you come in here and start talking to a 28-year-old with $35,000 or $50,000 of outstanding student debt, and you're just making stuff up off the top of your head, they're going to know, and it's going to go really, really badly for you. So I guess the takeaway for me is this is a topic where it's going to be obvious if you don't know what you're talking about. That means real world, knowledge. That means researching. That means practice. Read the case to your parents if they have outstanding student loans and things like that, and be sympathetic to the problems that these things pose for real folks in the real world. So with that, those are the initial thoughts we have. We've got a lot to cover, so we will come right back with some background, definitions, and framing. All right, let's kick things off with some background, definitions, and framing. And I think the good news on this topic is that it is a topic where definitions and framing won't play too much of a role. There will be a few issues that we'll talk about throughout the video where they could be relevant, but I don't think this is a topic where we're going to be playing a lot of like definitional games or really heavily relying on some kind of esoteric framing. It's a pretty standard policy topic focused on a very specific, unambiguous proposal, namely forgiving all federal student debt. So, in terms of definitions, just very briefly, federal student loan debt refers to the amounts that borrowers owe to pay back loans that they borrowed from the United States federal government through various lending programs to pay for their education, normally their college education. I don't think this needs a ton of clarification, but just very quickly, some background on how the federal government got into the student lending business. So federal funding for tuition for students really got started in 1944 when the GI Bill was passed. That allowed funding for armed forces members to attend college, basically by paying a large portion of their tuition. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, or the NDEA, which created loans for people to study subjects like engineering or science. It was really kind of geared toward like the space race that were deemed important for national security. In 1965, the government started guaranteeing private education loans made by banks. And so because the government was sort of the backstop, they were the guarantee, they would pay it off if you couldn't, that made those loans easier to get from these banks. In the 1990s, the Department of Education got into the business of directly lending to students, basically bypassing the middleman of these banks and lending directly to the people who needed it through the Student Loan Reform Act. And as of 2010, legislation now requires that all new federal student loan funding goes directly to students as opposed to going through some intermediary. So that's a really, really quick history. I don't think you need to know all of that. I think most of the debate is relevant to what's going on today. So the only other term I really think needs a definition is the term forgive. So to forgive a loan, that's a term of art. It means something in the law. It's different than like you say you're sorry and you get forgiven. So in the law, to forgive a loan just means, according to Investopedia, to release borrowers from their obligation to repay part or all of their federal student loan debt. Now, this actually does raise one small definitional issue that we should address, which is whether the pro has to advocate for total forgiveness of a given person's loan, or alternatively, whether some kind of like partial forgiveness, which, for example, is what the Biden proposal did and seeks to do in the future, whether that could be topical. And I think the answer here is very straightforward, and it comes from the other word in the resolution, which is all. So the resolution says that all federal student loan debt is the thing that we are forgiving, which strongly implies that only total forgiveness of a given loan, and then all of those loans, is topical. So like no partial relief, no conditional relief, none of these proposals like the Biden proposal or the Elizabeth Warren proposal that we'll mention later are going to be topical, which is something that we're going to talk about when we get to the con, because we're going to be discussing like alternatives and counterplans and just how much territory is out there for the con to use as a potential counterplan. So with that, let's jump into the much more interesting and really essential factual background on student loan debt in the United States today and how it has quickly grown into what is arguably crisis proportions.
So in order to get to that, let's get an overview of student debt in the United States. So a good numerical summary of the status of student debt is in the U.S. It comes from Education Data Initiative in 2023. They state that student loan debt, they have some student loan debt statistics. They basically highlight that student loan debt in the United States totals to $1.766 trillion. And that's a lot of money. That's a whole lot of money, and that's the outstanding federal loan balance. The outstanding federal loan balance is $1.6 trillion and accounts for 93.1% of all student loan debt.
And this is a good point to pause and mention that while the large majority, about 93% of student debt in the U.S. is owed to the federal government, not all of it is. There are also private loans for costs that go beyond what federal programs have to pay. For instance, I know very well, too well, more well, but better than I want to know about how this works, because to go to law school, I went to a pretty expensive law school, I had to take out both federal loans up to the maximum of what they would pay, right? And then beyond that, also I had to take out private loans from banks, which frankly were much more expensive. So there is private debt out there, it's just a small minority.
Right, and in addition to the amount, like money-wise, of loans that are taken out, the people that are taking out the loans, 43.6 million people are borrowing federal student loan, and they have federal loan student debt. The average federal student loan debt balances to about $37,718.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Because I thought mine was a ridiculous amount, and it turns out it's merely an excessive amount, not a ridiculous amount.
And that's wonderful.
So we appreciate that.
So look, you're out. You know, you're not the only one out there with student loan
right.
debt. we're right here with you. And while the total average balance, including private loan debt, may be a little bit higher, about $40,000. So the average public university student borrows about $32,000 to attain a bachelor's degree. So if you want to put this into very practical terms, which you always want to do in debate so you can make it digestible for your judge, the average monthly student loan payment is about $393, according to collegeinvestor.com in 2023. And they're citing the Federal Reserve. So the median payment, which is the number in the middle of the distribution, as opposed to you add them all up and you divide, is right in the middle, is lower than $222. So we use a median to reduce the impact of outliers, such as high student debt payments, so
like
people
me.
like doctors or like Brett,
like me.
Outliers like Brett. But that's right in the middle, it's $222 and not higher than that. But either way, hundreds of dollars a month can be a significant drain on middle class and working people. That said, we have to be very careful just assuming that the folks paying these debts are just the sympathetic underdogs, these little guys and these little girls paying off their ginormous student debt. Because of student debt is a huge problem, it's not nearly a universal one, though.
Right.
43.6 million people with student debt works out to about 17% of the adult population in the United States, which is about 260 million. So what we can see is that not everybody suffers from this struggle, but 17% of the adult population do. Yeah, most people don't. So we have to take that in consideration going forward. And additionally, the people who owe student debt tend to have higher incomes than average Americans, as the Brookings Institute noted in 2022. Sandy Baum and Adam Looney from Brookings, they stated that the highest income 40% of households, those with incomes above $74,000, own almost 60% of the outstanding education debt and make almost 3/4 of the payments. The lowest income 40% of households hold just under 20% of the outstanding debt and make only 10% of the payments.
Yeah, and while not all student debt loan holders are college graduates, in fact, one of the most serious problems is dropping out of with debt but no degree. We know that college degree holders tend to earn much more than non-degree holders, with bachelor's degree holders earning an average of $61,000 a year, while high school only graduates earned an average of $39,700 a year, according to the National Center for Education Statistics in 2021. These are important facts to keep in mind, especially as the negative, since they suggest that student loan forgiveness is really kind of an elitist policy.
Right.
It helps people who already are above average in income and in some cases far above average. So one question we'll be focusing on for the NAG will be why pick a policy that mainly helps those who are already doing much better than average as opposed to the truly indigent and poor. Additionally, student debt totals have risen pretty dramatically over the last 2 decades, per the same article from the Education Data Initiative, and we'll pop this graphic on the screen. As you can see from this chart, the total debt load of U.S. students has more than tripled since 2006, from $500 billion to $1.7 trillion in 2022. I mean, which is just insane. I mean, I can't even, I don't know how they give that much money out.
It's 1,000 billion, right?
Yeah.
Or $1 million dollars is what it is.
Which is ridiculous. Which is why people are starting to refer to it as a crisis, and I would say that is pretty warranted, and it's why we're debating it. That said, while total debt is still increasing, the rate of growth is at least slowing down a bit, I guess. As you can see here.
It's getting worse slower.
Yeah,
That's good.
It's only plateauing at $1.7 trillion. As you can see here in this graphic, which is also from the Education Data Initiative, the rate of growth for student loan debt fell to 0.47% to 1.17% total increases from 2021 to 2022. So it is decreasing slightly. But to be clear, this doesn't mean that the problem is going to go away or it is even shrinking. It just means that the problem is growing a little less quickly than it was growing a few years ago, which doesn't mean that there's a solution on the way.
Right.
And then, just to round things out, some statistics that even address the big picture of student loan debt in the United States, also from the Education Data Initiative, say 20% of all American adults with undergraduate degrees have outstanding student loan debt. 24% of postgraduate degree holders report outstanding student loan debt. 20% of U.S. adults report having paid off some student loan debt. So this is not just an issue for those that already have debt. This has been bogging down Americans for generations. I mean, this has continually plagued like millions of young people and student loan debt borrowers that have been participants in the economy. And I'm not going to read all of these statistics, but they'll be flashed up on your screen. I mean, you can just see how dire this issue is and how long-lasting it's been and how long-lasting it's going to continue to be because of this huge amount.
So if student debt is arguably becoming a crisis, who is it affecting? Or more specifically, who is borrowing? One common con argument you're going to see, as we've already alluded to, is that student loans are a problem that mainly affects relatively well-off people, but the truth is actually more complicated than that. So in reality, the demographics of these borrowers roughly mirror national demographics. Brookings has a very good breakdown of the data, so I'll let them do the talking. This is from Brookings in February of 2021. It says, in terms of demographics and educational attainment, households with student debt largely mirror the characteristics of households in the population at large, except they are better educated. Student loan borrowers are more likely to be white and highly educated. Indeed, among those that are making payments on student loans, the fraction of households that are white is the same as the population at large, but they are about 70% more likely to have a BA and twice as likely to have a graduate degree. So that said, because of the different background circumstances they face, federal student loans do differently affect different demographic groups. So the Roosevelt Institute says in January of 2021, black students in particular bear the brunt of the student debt burden. They borrow more often and in larger amounts to attend school, then graduate into a discriminatory job market that makes it more difficult to pay down these debts. One study found that 20 years after starting college, the median white borrower's debt has been reduced by 94%, while the median black borrower still owes 95% of their original balance. And this is what we're going to talk about on the Pro. We're going to talk about how the same rules that might be sort of colorblind on their face, when they're put into a world with vastly different backgrounds, like racial wealth gaps and things like that, can have vastly different effects.
But first, our next question is, how does student debt impact the economy as a whole? So what we know is that student loan debt is having a major impact on individuals who owe it, because there's thousands of dollars that they have. But how much does it affect the U.S. economy overall? Well, in the short run, probably not that much. According to Dr. Nella Richardson, they're from the ADP Research Institute, they stated in 2021 on a macroeconomic impact of student loan, they basically stated that surging student debt loads have had very little effect on consumer spending. According to the most generous estimates by the Federal Reserve, student debt has shaved at most 0.05% off of GDP in any 1 year.
Or 1/20th of 1%.
So very, very small effect here on spending. But the paltry economic cost in the short run belies the impacts of student debt on future investments and growth. Surging student loans negatively affect people and households by raising debt burdens, lowering credit scores, and limiting opportunities for home ownership and other financial investments. So, in other words, the short-term loss to the economy is very small. This makes intuitive sense. When people pay off loans, the lender typically reinvests the money back into the economy. Right. The federal government uses it to make more loans and thus yields more college graduates, or might use it to fund other programs. A private lender could invest the money in just about anything, but the money doesn't disappear, which is why the aggregate effect on the economy is very small. But as the Richardson article suggests, the short-term drag on the economy doesn't tell the whole story, even on a macroeconomic level. High student loan debt can lead people to make very different life decisions that, over the long term, can lead to very different outcomes for them individually and for the country as a whole. For example, as this piece from Alvaro Meza, and that's a very fun name, and others in the Journal of Labor Economics in 2022, they note that a $1,000 increase in student loan debt lowers the home ownership rate by about 1.8 percent points for public four-year college goers during their mid-20s, equivalent to an average delay of about 4 months in attaining ownership. Home ownership, in turn, has huge benefits both to individual and society, as illustrated by Lawrence Oon and Nadia Evangelou.
Nadia Evangelou?
Yeah, something like that. They're from the Social Benefits of Ownership in 2016. They said that home ownership boosts the educational performance of children, induces higher participation in civic and volunteering activity, improves health care outcomes, it lowers crime rates, and lessens welfare dependency. So there's a huge amount of impacts that comes with home ownership, and what we're seeing is that home ownership is decreasing because of these loans. And that's just one example. We could also point to things like delaying having children.
Hint, hint.
Yeah,
we will.
we definitely will get to that. And delaying saving for retirement, delaying saving for your own children's education, and thus continuing the cycle of loan debt dependency and so on. The point is, as we'll talk about in depth on the Pro, while student loan may not be a huge drag on the economy now, reducing or eliminating them has the potential to open up tremendous opportunities for growth, both for individuals and the economy as a whole.
But before we do that, we need to understand how the problem of student loan debt has gotten to where it is today. In other words, why is student loan debt increasing? The short answer is it's basically a confluence of three separate but related phenomena, and they're all summed up nicely in an article by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation in 2021, which we won't quote, but we will post in the notes. But briefly, the reasons go like this. One, first, more people are going to college or otherwise pursuing higher education. As the Peterson Foundation notes, in 2017, 8.6 million Americans took out a federal student loan, more than double the 4.1 million borrowers in 1995. So the rate has more than doubled over the past 20 years. And this is, broadly speaking, a good thing. Better educated people tend to be more productive and to create more value, both for the economy as a whole and for themselves. Additionally, there are decent arguments that higher education produces other positive externalities. For example, there are studies that show college graduates are more likely to volunteer, more likely to vote, and so on. But of course, you can't do a lot of that if you're being literally strangled by trillions of dollars of student loan debt. But second, at the same time this demand for higher education has been going up, state funding for higher education has been declining because the federal government is essentially giving a go-ahead for any student to pay any cost on their dole. This really got going in the wake of the Great Recession of the 2000s, when many states imposed cost-cutting austerity measures in their state budgets. As the Peterson Foundation notes, from the 2007 to 2008 academic year to the 2008-2009 year, state and local funding per student decreased by 10% and continued declining for the next 3 years while tuition prices soared over the same period. This in turn forced colleges and universities to make up the difference with higher tuition and fees, which for most people gets paid with loans. While students continually go and get more and more education, people or states are not putting near enough into state universities or subsidizing these education programs. Third and finally, there's where you might call the inelastic demand for college education. In other words, students and their parents are not as cost sensitive when choosing colleges as they might be when buying other goods and services, which has led many schools to raise prices, expand staff, build new facilities, and so on without much regard for keeping costs low.
And you just have to come on our campus. I mean, or any major college campus. Go see the fitness center, go see the brand new dorms, go see all the new administrative offices and things like that as compared to 20 years ago. It's just night and day.
In other words, when you and your parents come and tour MSU, you're a part of the problem. You're the one advertising to all these tour guides that I want to go see these great, shiny, fancy new facilities. instead of, I want my department to get more education and things like that.
When you tell your parents, oh, I've just got to go there because they've got the best new dorm, the best new fitness center, all these
they give out free ice cream.
Yeah, I don't care how much it costs. Then you, unfortunately, not you, but people are contributing to the problem. So one other really important reason for the increase in student debt, though, that sometimes gets ignored is the fact that student loan debt, unlike most other kinds of debt, normally cannot be discharged, which is to say wiped away via bankruptcy proceedings. This is something I have not seen mentioned very much in some of the materials out there on the topic, so I thought as a lawyer I'd talk about it. Bankruptcy laws are federal statutes that let people who've taken on debts that they can't pay get a fresh start. The rationale is that you're really no good to society if you're drowning in debt that you'll never pay off. So it makes sense to give you a second chance to wipe the debts away and give you a chance to go back to being productive. And to oversimplify it, when you declare bankruptcy in the federal system, you basically hand over most of your assets, with a few exceptions like maybe your house, maybe your car, to the court. The court takes them, liquidates them, basically sells them, and pays off as many of your creditors on a pro rata basis, like based on the share of what you owe them, as much as they can. And once they've gotten as much as they can out of you, they wipe the debts away and you start over. Your creditors get a fraction of what they're owed, your credit rating is ruined, your assets are mostly gone, but you get a second chance. And you can go and do this with almost any kind of debt, business debts, credit card debts, different things like that. But you generally can't do it under federal bankruptcy statutes with student debt, because the federal bankruptcy code contains provisions that carve most student debt out from the list of debts that can be discharged, with only a few exceptions. The main exception is if you can prove that paying off the loans would be a, quote, undue hardship. But don't get too excited. That doesn't just mean that it's like kind of hard, because trust me, it's hard for everybody. It's a very demanding standard that basically requires you to show that you can't even meet a minimal standard of living if you pay off your loans, which is very hard for any person with a job to do. And if you want a nice summary of bankruptcy rules on student debt, we'll link to a very good article. We're not going to read it, from the Patterson-Belknap law firm. But you might be saying, okay, Brett, that's all really interesting lawyer stuff, but why does this increase the amount of student debt? And the answer is, when debt can't be discharged in bankruptcy, the lender, in this case the federal government, has a lot less reason to be careful in lending it. Most lenders are going to look at your economic situation and your prospects and decide whether they think you're going to be able to pay them back, because they know there's a risk you might declare bankruptcy and they might never get their money back. But student loan lenders know that you are basically on the hook until you either pay them back or you die. Those are the only two ways out. So there's much less incentive for them to do their due diligence and try to restrict how much that they lend you. So they lend to just about everybody, which has pluses and minuses. One big plus is it means that by design, students from less affluent backgrounds normally have no trouble getting a federal student loan, whereas they would generally have trouble getting loans for things like businesses, mortgage loans, and so on. One big minus, though, is that they leave students with low incomes in this inescapable trap that other debts don't lead to. One last quick question you might be asking yourself if you've been reading up on current events is another lawyer one, so I'm also going to handle it as the resident lawyer on the team, which is forgiving federal debts somehow illegal or unconstitutional? Some debaters might be under the misconception that there is some legal or constitutional barrier to forgiving student debt because of a Supreme Court case from earlier this year, if they were following the news. But that's actually not true. Let me quickly explain why. So briefly, in June 2023, the Supreme Court decided a case called Biden versus Nebraska, holding that the Biden administration could not cancel student debt via executive action taken by the Secretary of Education. The administration had argued that there was some statutory language in a certain law about student debt called the HEROES Act that would let the Secretary unilaterally cancel all of this debt on his own without congressional approval. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 conservative versus liberal split, held that that was incorrect and that the Secretary did not have this unilateral power under the HEROES Act. In other words, Biden versus Nebraska was just about how the administration tried to cancel debt. That is to say, canceling it using an executive action without congressional approval, without statutory authority, not about whether the federal government can cancel debt. And there's a good article on this from the National Conference of State Legislatures in 2023 that we'll link to that explains all this if you want to be ready for some misguided team on the con arguing that it's like illegal or unconstitutional. There are plenty of perfectly legal ways that we could do this. The simplest one would be for Congress to literally just pass a law abolishing or forgiving student debt, or giving the Secretary of Education power to forgive the debt. Now, that's not going to happen in the real world because of politics, but there's no legal reason why it couldn't. So in short, as the neg, I would not rely on legality or constitutionality arguments. As the aff, I would probably have a quick block card ready to explain that this is a misguided argument. That case was only about how you do it, not whether you do it. And with that, I think we have a pretty solid, pretty efficient background on the problem of student loan debt. So gentlemen, why don't we jump next into arguments for the pro. Okay, so as we acknowledged earlier, pro has a little bit of an uphill fight here in comparison to some of the con arguments, but that doesn't mean there's not a fair amount to cover on the pro side, so we will jump right in with, I guess, 5 or 6 of our favorite arguments on it, starting off with one you wrote, Devin, calling this one stimulus package.
Sure, yeah, I think this argument's going to be kind of like the Excalibur, not because it's like a great argument or it's amazing, but you have almost nothing else to talk about.
It's one of 2 valid arguments.
We tried. The basic idea here is that millions of highly educated people in this country are carrying the millstone of overwhelming financial debt from student loans. As slightly touched on earlier, this burden is a major hurdle in the way of not only social mobility, but long-term economic investments like home ownership or savings. Lifting this burden would afford 40-some-odd million Americans the ability to make major changes in their economic behavior. It would be a financial shot in the arm, not just to borrowers, but to the economy as a whole, as the ripple effects move outward into society at large. This ripple effect or trickle-down effect, although I wouldn't use that term, unless you want to trigger Gen X judges who hate Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, we don't like Gen X liberals do not like trickle-down. So maybe just say ripple out.
Choose your language wisely.
Yeah.
Is sort of a built-in answer to common con arguments that debt forgiveness is elitist or regressive. Freeing up this debt would spur on a huge amount of investment into the economy, which would prove to be a universal boon, not a boondoggle. More jobs, more spending, and with only marginal inflationary pressure would mean more benefits for any and every participant in our economy. Earlier in the background segment, we mentioned the rising costs of the loans and the dramatically mounting sums of debt, so I won't belabor the point. However, we didn't much touch on the impacts of those costs. Slowing spending, less borrowing, obviously, less saving, less entrepreneurship, etc. have all plagued younger generations. Here are just some, and we implore you to read the entire article here, of the data from a report issued by the Education Data Initiative from September of this year. Each time a consumer's debt to income ratio increases by 1%, consumption declines by 3.7%, which doesn't seem like a really glitzy number, but it's a huge number in terms of relative spending. Because people don't own just 1% debt to income ratio. Debt may inhibit spending for decades, as 20 years after entering school, half of student borrowers still owe $20,000 each on outstanding loan balances. A joint study by Pennsylvania State University and Federal Reserve Bank finds a significant and economically meaningful negative correlation between changes in student debt and new businesses employing 1 to 4 employees, and we'll get into that a little bit later, specifically what they say. The data sheet continues on. Students with outstanding loan payments are 36% less likely to purchase a house. 13.3% of millennial renters indicate they will never be able to afford a home. 1 out of every 5 recipients of food stamps holds a post-secondary degree, which is just ridiculous.
Wow.
That decline in overall consumption in correlation to debt translates into the numbers reported on by Lauren, Janet, and Ella Karen, who write in the Washington Post in October of 2023, who say that to make room in their budgets for their loan payments, they're expected to cut back other spending. These are people that owe student debt to the tune of more than $100 billion annually. The United States' economic output could drop by 0.1% in 2023 and 0.3% in 2024 as a result, Oxford economic researchers said in July. And I just want to point this out. The NEG's going to get up there and they're going to read these numbers and they're going to say they're infinitesimally small, right? That we shouldn't rely on 0.1% declines in the economy to make our decisions. But the United States' economy is huge. Like that translates
$30 trillion.
Yeah, that translates to $100 billion. You need to be saying these numbers and not a 0.3% decline in the economic output. And as alluded to in those statistics, student loans also uniquely deprive enterprising young people from taking out loans to start new businesses. This debt strangles them in a way that no other debt does. Like Brett talks about, they can't even get this debt discharged when they go for bankruptcy. They also have to pay loans on this. I mean, this is literally just the starter debt going into the economy. To refer back to that study conducted between the Philly Reserve Bank and the Penn State, Penn State, Ambrose, Cordell, and Ma say in July of 2015, the utilization of student debt reduces an individual's ability to access other forms of credit. These results suggest a debt trade-off for new small firms in which larger amounts of student debt lowers individuals' ability to pay new small businesses, or to start small businesses, my bad. We find a significant and economically meaningful negative correlation between changes in student loan debt and net business formation for those firms with 1 to 4 employees. Based on our model, an increase of 1 standard deviation in student loan debt reduced the formation of new businesses with 1 to 4 employees by 14% on average. So this is pushing out billions of dollars worth of economic activity, not only in spending, but in business creation that would employ millions more people and bring in billions of dollars into our economy. The report from earlier puts it best. The effect on student loan debt has on the economy is similar to that of a recession. And this sentiment should be stressed when you're in round. This is not just a problem for millennials or for degree holders or even for borrowers. This is an issue for anyone that relies on an efficient economy. We cannot have only the older generations propping up the economy with spending and investment. Another thing to hammer home on is the fact that unlike a traditional recession, this is not a 3 to 5 year phenomenon. This slowdown will last for decades to come and probably worsen. So we need to act on what is the only proper solution, and that is full forgiveness.
Yeah, so in other words, we talked earlier about how you want to use language that's accessible and memorable. So like permanent recession is a tagline that you can use. Student debt is a permanent recession. Does it reduce the economy by 50%? No, but it drags it in a way as if we were in a permanent recession. So that is the problem. What then is the solution? Well, if you are watching a video about a debate topic on federal loan forgiveness, I think you probably have a guess as to what we're going to say the solution is. So the Roosevelt Institute in January of 2021 says freeing up funds through debt cancellation, which is just another word for debt forgiveness, would allow millions of borrowers to spend into the broader economy, increasing real GDP by between 86 billion and 108 billion. And there's those absolute numbers Devin was talking about. Don't talk about 0.1%. Talk about 86 billion, 108 billion. Small fraction of the overall economy, huge amount in absolute terms. New economic activity generated by debt cancellation would reduce the unemployment rate between 0.22 and 0.36 percentage points per year. And remember, put that in context, right? Our total unemployment rate is below 4%. So 0.22 to 0.36 is a huge portion of the unemployment rate. Debt cancellation would also boost entrepreneurship and small business creation, a driver of economic growth. The number of young entrepreneurs is in steep decline, and the share of startups founded by millennials has been cut in half over the last 20 years. Of that age group, 50% reported that student loans affected their ability to start a business, and total debt burdens resulted in an estimated 2 million fewer businesses being formed between 2006 and 2015. Again, absolute numbers are your friend when you are on the probe. The Levy Institute in February of 2018 specifically says peak job creation in the first few years following the elimination of student loan debt adds roughly 1.2 million to 1.5 million new jobs per year. The upshot of all of this is that broad across-the-board loan forgiveness would be a major stimulant in a sector of the economy, which is new business formation and millennial entrepreneurship that is slowing. This is not some elitist wealth transfer. This is a tide that will lift all boats. Additionally, as we talked about a little earlier, if you want to vary things up, you can link this general stimulus argument to specific impacts to throw a little bit more variety and unpredictability at your opponents on the con. For example, like we mentioned earlier, there's home ownership and the benefits that come from that. There's entrepreneurship, which we just talked about. There's also the problem of debt delaying people having children. For example, there's this piece from Jessica Dickler with CNBC in 2018 noting in a March poll by Future Family, a startup that helps women understand fertility, 44% of women said they had student debt. Half of those women said the loans affect their decisions about having children. Future Family polled nearly 1,000 women in the U.S. who are ages 25 to 40 and didn't have children. We find that concerns about finances and student debt specifically are factoring in more, said Claire Tompkins, Future Family CEO. It ends up being a financial equation that's a little untenable. Another CNBC article from 2022 notes that 81% of people with student loans say they've had to delay one or more key life milestones because of their debt. 42% delay paying off other loans, 40% delay investing money, 38% delay saving for retirement, 35% delay travel, 33% delay buying a home, 16% delay having a baby, 14% delay getting married, and 12% delay finding a new job.
So you might say, well, having children is nice. Well, right, you're the only
I don't
one.
know. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Hey,
You know? It's fine.
It's okay, I guess.
If you're watching this, Ben, it's great.
But why is this an economic stimulus issue? Well, as it turns out, declining childbirth rates have a huge economic implications for the country decades down the road.
Right.
As children and family policy commentator Elliot Haspel, they note in 2023, around the world in places like Japan, Europe, and China, lower birth rates mean fewer workers to support the economic infrastructure that makes prosperity possible. They leave a large number of older and retired people without the foundation of young labor needed to support them, and lead to huge gaps in the funding needed to pay for things like social safety nets and infrastructure. These young people are necessary, and these old people need them. So if there's decline and a regression of these young people being there, then there's going to be an issue. So I'm not going to read the entire quote, but as you can see here, there's a very real threat from declining birth rates. And if you can link student debt to that, you can argue that removing this obstacle to having children is key to averting long-term economic catastrophe. So anyway, that's a real quick rundown of some options for the economic stimulus argument, which I think will be a feature of many, if not most, pro cases. Now let's move on and take a look at gender and racial equity.
Yeah, so after economic stimulus, I think the next most common set of arguments, I guess we might say on this, the one other set of arguments that you're likely to see from pro-debaters is probably going to be a focus on addressing social inequality in the form of racial and gender disparities. So a good summary of the problem, or I would actually say problems, as race and gender are kind of separate issues here, comes from Heidi Rivera at Bankrate.com in 2022, and it says, historically, the burden of student loans has disproportionately affected both women and people of color. In fact, a study by the American Association of University Women found in 2019, women owned nearly 2/3 of the nation's student loan debt. Additionally, because of the gender pay gap, women face more difficulties when it comes to paying off their loans, as they don't have as much disposable income as men. Likewise, a study by the Institute on Assets and Social Policy found that 20 years after leaving college, black borrowers at the median still owed 95% of their cumulative debt, as we said earlier, while white borrowers at the median had reduced their debt by 94%. So why do these differences exist? Well, let's start with the racial disparities. In that case, it's mainly a function of the larger racial wealth gap that exists in American society. And this comes to us from Marissa Wright, writing for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 2023. Fantastic article. You should read the whole thing. What it says is the racial wealth gap describes the significant difference in the wealth held by white people and people of color in the United States. This gap is striking and staggering, encapsulated by the fact that black households have about 7 cents on the dollar in wealth compared to white households. This stark gap stems from years of entrenched structural racism. And the way this applies specifically here, she goes on to say, as students of color begin college, the racial wealth gap often worsens. Because they have fewer socioeconomic resources, less parental and generational wealth, less home equity to finance a loan, fewer savings, students of color are forced to take on more debt to cover tuition and living expenses to make up for the wealth gap between them and their white peers. Data from the U.S. Department of Education indicates that around 86% of black students take out a student loan, compared with only 68% of white students. Black students also typically owe more than white students. Black borrowers take out an average of $39,500 in student loans, while white students borrow an average of $29,900. So naturally, if a group starts from an economically disadvantaged position with less wealth to fall back on because of centuries of structural inequality, you're going to see that group needing to borrow more for an education. Wright next explains why debt forgiveness solves the problem. In other words, sort of a built-in solvency card, or at least this manifestation of the problem. She says, forgiving student loan debt would allow Black and Latinx borrowers to experience the economic advantages of going to college without enduring higher economic barriers to entry than their white peers. And it would help free them of high interest rates and predatory lending that saddles them with even more debt than they originally took out for their education. Ultimately, student loan forgiveness will allow people of color to build wealth over time, helping to close the racial wealth gap that has persisted for the whole of this country's history. And I should add As I said earlier, The Right Piece is just a great article that you should read in its entirety. It contains a lot of other stuff and sources that you can mine, but for example, it includes this built-in response on why narrower counter plans like targeted debt relief or partial debt relief aren't enough. It says, the Biden administration's forgiveness plan, which is a partial forgiveness plan, still leaves many black graduates burdened with substantial debt. It says Amelia, and I'm not even going to try that name, senior policy counsel at some group in a recent interview. We need to pursue more holistic solutions to increase access to affordable higher education and degree completion for black students, ensure equitable pay and employment opportunities for black graduates, and eliminate other barriers to building black wealth, such as appraisal bias. To ensure that broad loan cancellation advances equity and supports all borrowers, especially historically marginalized communities, student loan forgiveness must be robust and comprehensive. It can't be a part-way deal. You can't justify saying, well, let's address the wealth gap, but only in this one area and only partly, right? The racial wealth gap, that's bad. Let's get rid of 20% of it, right? That's just not something. That's a hard sell to make, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, partial forgiveness is not enough to remove the disparity because the status quo system is rigged in favor of the wealthy, who happen in most cases to be white. Another piece that makes this argument really well is one by Andre Perry and others with the Brookings Institution in 2021, talking again about student loans and the racial wealth divide. And it talks about how the system is literally rigged in favor of wealthier families that overwhelmingly tend to be white. What it says is the nation's tax system invisibly subsidizes high wealth households. For students with education debt, the IRS allows tax filers, married or single, to deduct up to $2,500 in student loan interest from their taxes every year. This means that borrowers with high debts will only be able to deduct a portion of their interest payments. 4 years after graduation, the average black college graduate owes $52,726 compared to $28,000 for the average white college graduate. With federal interest rates between 2.75 and 5.3%, what this means is that the average white household is going to be able to deduct all of their loan interest payments, while the average black household cannot. Here again, what we're seeing is a facially race-blind policy that doesn't mention race because of historical realities becomes a racially biased policy, right? And a partial solution doesn't solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Right. Shifting gears to gender disparities, the problem is a little bit more complex. First, women are more likely than men to go to college, so you would assume, oh, these are more privileged people, but not necessarily the case. They also tend to borrow slightly more than men while in school. And they're somewhat more likely to take jobs in socially useful fields like teaching or social work that sadly do not pay as much as they should. And of course, there is the larger gender wage gap, all of which comes together to leave women shouldering more of the burden of student debt. For a good explanation of the scope of gender disparities, we can look to the American Association of University Women. Deeper in debt, in 2017, they write, in a given year, about 44% of women enrolled in undergraduate programs take out loans compared to 39% of men. Women enrolled in undergraduate programs take on an average of about $3,100 in student loans per year, about $400 more than the average man. By graduation, the typical woman receiving a bachelor's degree in 2011 to 2012 had an average of about $21,000 in student loans, $1,500 more than the typical man. Given women's higher enrollment, their larger initial loans, and their slower rate of repayment, we estimate that 64% of student loan debt is held by women, which is insane. It's an insane disparity. A CNBC article from 2021 puts it even more bluntly. Researchers at the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce have found that in order for women to earn equal sums as men, they must earn an additional degree. Right. So they must go further into debt to make just as much as a man with a lower degree. For instance, a woman with a bachelor's degree earns $61,000 per year on average, roughly equivalent to that of a man with an associate's degree. In part due to the need to compete in this imbalanced labor market, women attend college at higher rates than men and thus make up the majority of student loan borrowers. This leads to women facing disproportionately tough burdens in comparison to men, which I think should be plain after all of that. Heidi Rivera, Bankrate.com in 2021 says, women struggle more to repay their student loans compared to men due to higher balances coupled with lower wages. On average, women earn 83% of what men earn, with 1/3 saying that student loan payments account for over a quarter of their income, which again is insane. So in short, efforts like the Title IX to grant access to higher education for women, if only we had a Title IX lawyer on our panel.
If only you had the university's Title IX
That's right.
Efforts like the Title IX to grant access to higher education for women have proven spectacularly successful. Did you write this?
I mean, it is objectively true.
No,
Oh, yes.
I agree.
Title IX has worked. We're outnumbered, gentlemen. So.
Well, I think
We are.
that's a good thing. We should be improving access. But that success has proven to be a double-edged sword, since higher education is expensive, leading women to take on a disproportionate share, about 2/3 of the student loan debt in the United States. So the pro would argue the key to making good on the promises of gender equity, mitigating the gender wage gap, and ensuring real equality is to eliminate the burden of federal student loan debt. And with that, we move on to
Increased access.
Oh, right. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yes, increased access. So this is one argument that seems to have a lot of potential for the pro, and it's the idea of forgiving student loan leads to greater access to higher education. And while this is certainly a great argument for reforming how we finance higher education, I don't know if it's a particularly strong argument for forgiving existing debt.
Yep.
Let me explain. There's plenty of evidence that high school students are more skeptical about higher education than they were previously. For example, Jessica Dickler from CNBC in 2021, she states that a recent survey of high school students found that the likelihood of attending a four-year school sank nearly 20% in less than a year, down to 53% from 71%, according to ECMC Group. It's a nonprofit aimed at helping student borrowers. Almost 1/3 of high schoolers said that the pandemic's financial impact made it less likely that they will attend a four-year college, the report found. More than half said that they could achieve professional success with 3 years or less of college, and just 1/4 believe a four-year degree is the only route to a good job. Okay, so far, so good. Cost is leading many students to 2023 to reconsider higher education. We think higher education is good, so we want to address that.
But here's the question. How would forgiving existing student debt make current high school students or anybody else currently considering college more likely to attend? It doesn't apply to them. The term forgive strongly implies an existing debt that is wiped away. That's what the legal term forgive means. It doesn't mean we change our future policies about debt. It means we take the debts that currently exist and we wipe them away. When real-world experts talk about debt forgiveness, they are always talking about retroactive removal of existing debt. When they talk about forward-looking reforms, they don't call it debt forgiveness. They call it something different, like making college free or reform of student debt or something like that, because there is no debt yet to forgive for you as a high school student or for other people who are looking at college. In other words, the most plausible interpretation of the resolution is that it only applies as a backwards-looking solution to people who have already borrowed money, already gone to college, already graduated or not graduated. It's not about making college more affordable for you. It's about making college more affordable for your parents, maybe your older siblings or cousins who have already graduated. So it's really hard for me, at least, to understand the link between affirming the resolution and like making the class of 2024 or 2025 more likely to go to college. I mean, look, let's put it this way. Let's say tomorrow your 30-year-old cousin pops in and says, "Hey, guess what, cuz? You know, I just had my debt wiped away. Joe Biden and the Democrats, they wiped all my debt away. It's all gone, right? It's completely gone." What would you do with that? Would you say to yourself, "Oh, cool, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go gamble that they're going to do this exact same thing again in 10 years. So I'm going to take out a bunch of student debt that I can't afford on the gamble that they're going to do this again one day with my debt." Of course you wouldn't do that. You're not stupid, right? And that's a really big problem for the pro on this topic, which is that it is almost entirely a backwards-looking solution, at least in terms of like getting people to get an education. Whatever gains to education or access were going to be had, they're already in the bag. These people already went to college. They happened back in 2005 or 2015. So apart from like the economic stimulus, that will happen now, and also addressing past inequities like on race and gender, and that's very important. There's no denying that. It's really hard to see a link to any future benefits that affirming this policy does to change anything in the future.
Yeah, and anyway, since we know the con has some strong objections to the practical effects of debt forgiveness, why don't we spend a few minutes looking at some pro responses to common con arguments, because we don't have anything else to say.
Because what else are you going to do?
Yeah, right.
There's like 2.5 arguments.
all we
I
got.
just gave you the arguments.
Yeah, there you
That's
go.
it. So, but just to sort of
You
better
can decide
prepare
what
you.
order you put them
You
in.
can do 2 or 1. Or
Yeah,
One
for
or
the rest
two.
of this video, please do decide. Just jog your brain
Right.
about what you're going to do with that.
But there are some good blocks and responses, so we'll talk about those.
So the first one is debt forgiveness is not regressive. As we mentioned earlier, probably the single most common direct attack you'll see from the con, as opposed to like a counter plan or something similar, will be the idea that it's somehow regressive. That is, that its benefits flow from people with greater advantages and less need. In other words, they help mainly college graduates who are less than half of the population and tend to have higher incomes. This is as opposed to a progressive policy which would help economically less advantaged people, which arguably is what social programs and spending is really supposed to do, and forgiving a debt is a form of spending, so why are we spending it on people who already earn more? And we're certainly going to make this argument ourselves when we get to the con, but for now, Pro really needs a response. So luckily, there are some good ones, including basically a pre-written rebuttal card from Perry and others with the Brookings Institution in 2021. And I'm not going to read it, but as you can see, it gives a very nice 3-point response to the regressive policy argument, pointing out that 1, many debtors didn't actually graduate. 2, having student debt means your family wasn't rich enough to pay for college. And 3, the loans that the highest income folks used are often private loans, which are typically necessary to cover the high cost of things like law school and med school, and those will not be forgiven. So this idea that doctors and lawyers will get off scot-free simply isn't true.
So anyway, this gives you a solid foundation to at least write a good block against the idea that it's a regressive policy, which is to say, no, it's not. The reason you needed these loans is because you weren't rich. And the really rich people, like, again, my student loans to go to a big law school were mostly private. So those will not be wiped away. So there are some actually good responses on that. But anyway, in addition to that, what about counter plans? Specifically like counter plans or counter advocacies that propose some kind of like income-based cutoff or a means test for who gets the relief. I think that's going to be popular. We're going to talk about it on the con. What do you say to that? I think there actually is a really good response that income-based counter plans don't solve anything and make the problem worse. So we have this very nice piece from Andre Perry at Brookings which explains exactly how income-based relief programs work in the status quo. And it shows that they actually don't solve the problem and may make them much worse. What they say is that income-driven repayment radically shifts the premise of the student loan program away from a given principal balance and a fixed repayment term like 10 years and toward income as the basis for repayment amounts. Borrowers are required to make payments equal to a given percentage of their disposable income for a certain number of years, and if any principal remains outstanding after that term, then it's forgiven. Not surprisingly, balances on loans in IDR, or income-driven repayment, are increasing over time rather than decreasing. Our data shows that the share of loans in which the balance is increasing rather than being paid down is rising both over time and across origination years, to the point that a majority of loans now have a higher balance than they did initially. This is why we assert that these loans are never going to be repaid. Let me explain what this means. In the status quo, when we do this sort of income-based selective repayment scheme, this is actually a worse version of blanket forgiveness, and let me explain why. We lower your monthly payments to something that you can quote-unquote afford, but that's not enough to even cover the interest on the loan, much less pay down the principal. So what's going on is the interest that you can't pay on your loan is actually getting added to the amount you owe. So somehow, unbelievably, what this piece is saying is that when we use income-based repayment as an option or as an alternative, what ends up happening is the amount of the loan goes up. We force the debtor to make these smaller payments for years, sometimes up to a decade, during which time the government doesn't get paid off at all. The debt is going up. It only gets bigger due to interest. And then finally, once they've spent their 20s or much of their 30s carrying this terrible financial burden, we finally forgive the debt after they've put off buying a home, having children, saving for retirement, and so on. In other words, in comparison to just blanket immediate forgiveness, income-driven schemes are worse for everybody. They're worse for the government because the debt goes up, not down, and it's worse for the individual debtor because the relief is delayed until it becomes, for many, largely a moot point after they've spent many years of their life suffering under it. So this is a really handy card to have against opponents who want to run an alternative or a counter plan that says, oh, we'll base it on income, and you just say, yeah, no, we're already doing that in the status quo. And there's no reason to think that the government is going to magically change how we do it in the future. This is how they do it. It's terrible. The debt goes up, right? We delay the impact, and it demonstrably does not work.
So the last reason we have for the pro is forgiveness and systemic reforms aren't mutually exclusive. So this is the last point we have for the pro, and a lot of con teams are going to argue that debt forgiveness doesn't address the underlying problems of student loans, like rising cost, inability to discharge in bankruptcy, wealth gaps, and so on. And the pro's basic response on this is that that's undeniably true. Wiping away student debt won't keep more debt from piling up in the future if we don't change the system. But that's precisely why these are separate issues. Debt forgiveness is like removing all the gunk from your clogged up engine so it can run again. Systemic reform is like making a plan to regularly change your oil so it doesn't happen again. And the latter can't happen without the former, and the two certainly aren't mutually exclusive, which means they don't compete against one another. To use a policy debate term, which means that the need for systemic reform is not a reason to vote con. This is really a common sense point, but if you need a card saying as much, there it is here. It's I don't know how to say his name.
Elon?
But Elon Levin.
Elon Levin?
I mean, what a cool DJ name. But I mean, I don't know. But there's the card up there. I'm not going to read it for you, but it's a really good card, basically saying what.
They don't compete against
They
each
don't
other,
compete
right?
each other. So at minimum, the weaker claim is that solving the immediate crisis and getting the engine running again does not conflict with longer-term systemic reform.
You can do both.
You can do both, and it's not mutually exclusive. The stronger claim, and I don't have a card for this one, but you might want one or just argue it as a logical point, is that debt forgiveness, if anything, would only increase momentum for long-term reforms to make college more affordable and debt less erroneous, because people will see the benefits that the current generation of student debtors get and want to make sure they get the same benefits for themselves in the future. So it's setting a precedent.
So that's the pro. We did the best we possibly could. I think, gentlemen, we did pretty well.
Well done, fellas.
It's just, and ladies, and kings and queens and monarchs of all genders. But that's the best that we could do. And so with that, we've got a lot to cover on the cons. So let's take a really short time out and do exactly that. Okay, so like we've said on a number of occasions so far, we all think that the con has the stronger position on this resolution, mainly for a couple of reasons. Because the pro is, as we said, locked into this one specific solution that does have some clear upsides, but it also has a lot of downsides, which lets the con do two things. First, it can prepare really well to address a handful of pro arguments. On the con, be ready for economic stimulus, which we're going to talk about, and be ready with responses to like race and gender and equity. And you're probably in a pretty good place if you've done both of those and have good blocks. But secondly, the con also can use like alternatives and counter plans to argue that, yeah, sure, we absolutely agree something needs to be done about student debt, but this just isn't the right solution. Like, this is not the way to do it. So anyway, there is a lot to cover, so let us jump right in. The first and most obvious con argument / objection is it's expensive.
It's just so expensive. Like, there is a ridiculous amount of money associated with this, and as the con, you need to make this known in round. Remember, we're going to be holding the pro to their burden of forgiving all student debt, not some limited hybrid plan like those floated by Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer, or Joe Biden. So what does that cost actually look like? So the estimates and comparisons, according to the Department of Education as of February of 2021, forgiving all federal loans, as Senator Bernie Sanders proposed, would cost on the order of $1.6 trillion. So to put this spending in the context of total spending on selected income support programs, this chart, as we're going to pop up on the screen, it shows the comparison of the cost of student debt forgiveness in comparison to other major social programs. So right below forgiving all student loan debt, you can see that unemployment insurance, earned income tax credit, all those things are up there, food stamps, and that's a lot. That's substantially more than unemployment insurance, earned income tax credit, and food stamps. It more than doubles the amount of money that is allocated for Pell Grants, which are targeted only to those who actually need the financial help, unlike most federal loans. So to put the scale of this spending in context, Brookings confirms the scale of this spending. They state that widespread student loan forgiveness would rank among the largest transfer programs in American history. Forgiving all student debt would be a transfer larger than the amounts the nation has spent over the past 20 years on unemployment insurance, larger than the amount it had to spend on earned income tax credit, and larger than the amount it has spent on food stamps. Likewise, it dwarfs spending on programs that help feed low-income pregnant women and infants or provide energy assistance to those who otherwise struggle to heat their homes in the winter. So there are two things that can be seen from this evidence. The first is that there's a huge amount of money. But second, it's an amount of money that dwarfs that we spend on people who uniformly actually are poor, like home heating aid for low-income folks, which is precisely the bad look the con wants to attach to loan forgiveness for college graduates.
But wait, it gets worse. Because the cost of this program is not just the amount that we'll spend or forego recovering, and we're going to talk later about how they're the same thing, like collecting is the same thing as spending, but it will be magnified by the economic harms that it creates. And the first way this happens is by pouring gas on an economic fire, triggering even more inflation. So this is from Jason Furman, former chairman of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors in 2022. He says pouring roughly $500 billion of gasoline on the inflationary fire that is already burning is reckless. Everyone else will pay for this. He's talking about student debt relief, either in the form of higher inflation or higher taxes or lower benefits in the future. This is a great preemptive response to pro-claims about economic stimulus. The response is basically, we need exactly the opposite of economic stimulus right now. The economy is red hot, but that leads to inflation, which drives up costs for everybody. And we need to be tapping the brakes, but this does exactly the opposite. This is explained by Arthur Laffer, the sort of famous conservative economist, author of the Laffer Curve, in 2022. And it says, of course, it will clearly worsen inflation. Inflation is really too much money chasing too few goods. Forgiving student loans will reduce the number of goods, which is inflationary. It will increase the size of the monetary base, which is also inflationary. Laffer estimated that if everyone who qualified to receive the $10,000, by the way, this is just $10,000 worth of relief. This isn't what we're actually proposing here, which is total relief. It would cost $440 billion in a $22 trillion economy, or roughly 2%. Laffer said 2% constitutes a big number in economic spending. For a much smaller plan of forgiveness, like we said, the inflation amount would be roughly 2%. So as Laffer said, this 2% is a huge amount that would drastically change the economy. For a plan to forgive all student loan forgiveness, it would probably be something closer to 6 or 7%, which is really drastic. And this is a great argument because you don't even have to win it. You just basically have to fight the pro to a draw on the economic impact. Look, they're going to put out their evidence on stimulus and growth, and you're going to put out your evidence on inflation, and these speeches are short, the round is relatively short, and you say, look, Judge, okay, fair enough. Even if you believe all their arguments about growth, it's a wash. Maybe the economy grows, but all of the benefits of growth are offset, especially for working class people, by the cost of everything going up. And in a real world typical PF round with a normal anything but the greatest teams in the country, that's going to end up being a total wash in most cases. You're just going to say, oh yeah, there's growth, but there's also inflation, so everything costs more. In other words, in addition to the literal price tag of $1.6 or $1.7 trillion, the inflationary cost of this is going to be felt by people who have no direct benefit from it. And I would literally say to the judge, this is just another example of one of these cases where you need to say it in very plain terms. It might be nice for a young lawyer in a law firm making $150,000 a year to get rid of their monthly loan payment. Maybe they could go, buy a vacation home or something. But inflation means that cost, that giveaway, is going to be paid for in the form of higher prices by the single mother who is working as a checkout clerk, who never went to college, never had any student loans, and gets zero benefits from this proposal.
Yeah, and that's actually a great transition to our second point, which is that it disproportionately benefits wealthier Americans.
Right.
That lawyer that makes a ton of money is not an insane outlier, because those that actually earn degrees are going to be making making money within the top bracket of income in this country. The highest earners are rewarded the most. As we said earlier, the pro wants to paint student loan forgiveness as a policy aimed at helping the little guy. But in reality, at best, it helps what you might call the middle guy, and completely leaves out people with much greater need. According to the House Committee on Ways and Means in October of 2023, despite the administration's attempts to target low-income borrowers, top earners will still benefit the most from Biden's student loan giveaway. Analysis from the Committee for a Responsible Budget found that America's highest earners will reap nearly 2/3 of the giveaway. This leads into the argument, which we'll get into later, that all this spending, even if you think it would be a good idea generally, would be better targeted towards people who actually need it the most, which is what we do with pretty much every other form of social spending there is. That is the goal of social spending. It's not to give somebody a free $500 because why not? So why would debt forgiveness help middle and upper income people? Well, we already talked about this at the start of the video, but to put a slightly finer point on it, according to a group of researchers who collect data and statistics about U.S. education posted on the educationdata.org in May of 2022, they say that Americans with income over $74,000 hold about 60% of the total public student loan debt, while households that earn $35,000 or fewer a year hold about 20% of the student public loan debt. This would be aimed at helping those at the very top. And we'll pop this income bracket and student debt comparison graph on the board from that study. So as you can see here in this chart, considerable amounts of student debt are held by households who are bringing in very nice annual incomes in the six-figure range. And this is, of course, entirely predictable since college graduates and professional degree holders earn more than the population at large. The people benefiting from this forgiveness are evident. It is the people who are already paying back their loans in the first place. This is just compounded with the jobs that these higher income households are pursuing. And if that's not enough, you have the fact that some of the biggest borrowers are people with advanced and professional degrees, whose incomes are at the very top of the distribution. According to a Brookings Institute estimate, they give statistics for the percentage of people who borrowed for master's degrees and PhDs in October of 2019. They say that people who borrowed for master's degrees and PhDs hold 56% of the student loan debt, according to Brookings Institute estimates. Holding a master's or doctorate degree is also correlated to higher incomes. People with master's degrees earn about $2.7 million over a lifetime, more than twice what those with high school diplomas earn, which is $1.3 million. PhD holders earn $3.3 million more over a lifetime. And as you can see in this chart, these high-earning folks with advanced degrees aren't some tiny minority of those with student debt. They own almost half of all student debt in the United States. Look at this graph that will pop on the screen. And I would literally be saying to the judge, based on this chart, 48% of this supposedly populist program to help those in need is going to go to people with master's degrees, doctorate degrees, and professional degrees like doctors and lawyers. In other words, this is a giveaway to the upper middle class, not a program for ameliorating the ills of the poor.
And this is actually an argument that is being used right now in the real world by opponents, typically Republicans, of debt forgiveness, which segues nicely into a related point, which I have tagged as loan forgiveness is unpopular. It helps elect Republicans who will enact regressive policies. This is basically what we might call, if we were in policy debate, a politics disad, where we argue that enacting a particular policy will trigger a particular political backlash, and the result of that backlash will outweigh any of the benefits of the policy. So, according to Ariel Edwards-Levy with CNN Politics of 2022, student loan forgiveness divides Americans a lot, and absolute forgiveness is really not very popular. And what it says is a March poll of Americans aged 18 to 29 conducted by the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, 38% of young adults said that the government should cancel student loan debt for everyone. 21% said that debt should only be canceled for those most in need. 27% said the government should not cancel debts but help with repayment, and 13% said there should be no change. In other words, only about 31% of Americans support the policy put forward in this resolution. Not hard to see why, because most Americans don't benefit from it. With 61%, and it's divided up in all these other numbers, but when you add them up, 61% opposing the policy put forward here. And when you get further into the numbers, they actually get worse for debt forgiveness. So this is from Emily Elkins at the Cato Institute in September of 2022. It says that nearly 2/3 of Americans oppose cancellation of debts if forgiving $10,000 per borrower would raise their taxes, or if it would primarily benefit higher income people. 68% oppose it then. About 3/4 of Americans would oppose student debt cancellation if it caused universities to raise their tuition and fees. And of course, at least some of these trade-offs that they're talking about in this article are going to just be reality. For example, we already know debt forgiveness is going to benefit higher income people more than others. So right there, you're moving into the 68% opposed territory right off the bat. And there is every chance that if we set a precedent for canceling debt and giving away more free federal money, that yes, colleges and universities absolutely will respond to that free money bonanza by raising their prices. That's what they've done so far. And look, even if you personally disagree with these arguments, you can say to the judge, what you can be certain of is that Republicans, who are generally kind of hostile to higher education in general, will use this elitist debt forgiveness scheme to motivate working class Americans to vote for them in the upcoming election. They will say things like, why should an electrician who had to take out a loan to buy his tools and his truck get nothing, while some gender studies graduate from Oberlin gets her debt taken care of? And there is a good chance that that argument will resonate with some people. There is an economic angle to this, but if we're being candid, there's also a social and even racial angle to it. Bryn Tannehill in 2022 writes, the real reason the GOP opposes forgiving student loans. And she writes, unlike nearly every other law or policy in the history of the United States that's neutral on its face but benefits one group more than others, Biden's student loan forgiveness benefits black people disproportionately more than white people, although plenty of white people still benefit. And many white people hate that. This comes from a similar impulse that made Reagan's welfare queen's rhetoric so effectively. Unsurprisingly, when you delve into the crosstab data for who is most opposed to student loan forgiveness, you find that they are older, whiter, wealthier, non-college graduates, which not coincidentally also describes the GOP base. And it is not just progressives and commentators that are seeing the problem here for Democrats if they forgive all student debt, how bad that looks. Even Democrats recognize that this dynamic could hurt the policy with white, non-college educated voters who are a huge voting bloc in swing states. So Josh Kraushaar with Axios in 2022 talks about how Democrats are recognizing that there could be a backlash against student loan debt forgiveness. Democrats running in battleground Senate and House races panned President Biden's student loan relief plan within hours of its release, a sign of fears that it could alienate swing voters. Tim Ryan, the Democrats' Ohio Senate nominee, released a critical statement. Waiving debt for those already on a trajectory to financial security sends the wrong message to millions of Ohioans without a degree working just as hard to make ends meet. Nevada Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, one of the most vulnerable Democratic senators up for re-election, told Axios, I don't agree with today's executive action. It doesn't address the root problems that make college unaffordable. From there, once you show that this is unpopular, it's going to hurt Democrats, then what you do is you just link to the fact that both houses and the presidency are up for election in 2024. And even small, and they're all tight races, extremely tight races, and even small impacts have the potential to tip the outcome one way or the other very easily. And then you just link to the fact that Republicans are more, if your opponent is saying, well, we're going to do this socially progressive thing, we're going to get rid of racial inequality, and we're going to help the little guy, you just link to the fact that Republicans are supporting all kinds of socially regressive policies that hurt women and hurt minorities and hurt the poor. That's the argument that you make, at least, right? This is just a debate channel. We're not necessarily taking political positions, but that's the argument you would make. And so basically you turn all of the pros equity arguments 180 degrees and say student debt forgiveness will be a one-time short-term fix that will cost us the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It will hand control of the government over to a party that really could do long-lasting damage in many different fields. Anyway, you get the idea. So the next major con point is loan forgiveness only acts as a Band-Aid.
And this may be an offensive point for the con, or it may just be a defensive response to a lot of potential pro arguments. But the basic idea is that loan forgiveness solves nothing in the long run. It's a purely backwards-looking policy that, at absolute most, mitigates some of the damage done in previous years and decades, but does absolutely nothing to stop us from inflicting the same damage to the next generation going forward. And this is one-time forgiveness. It doesn't solve the problem. The core problem that the U.S. faces, which is both a symptom and a cause of the student debt issue, is that the fact that higher education costs far more than it ever has before, and far more than most people can afford. According to Education Data Initiative in August of 2023, they state the cost of tuition at public four-year institutions increased 9.24% from 2010 to 2022. In just 12 years, it's increased nearly 10%, 9.24%. After adjusting for currency inflation, college tuition has increased 747.8% since 1963. So this is why you hear your parents and grandparents saying, well, I was able to pay for college with a part-time job. I worked at the bookstore. And the response is, fantastic, Grandpa, but that world no longer exists. Right. The same college education cost about 8 times what it did, adjusted for inflation, when you went to school, Grandpa. So what we can see is that it's increased 747%. We aren't living in the same world. Things have changed. So why has the cost increased? So we touched on this earlier, and the short answer is that there are a lot of reasons. But the common thing is that none of them get solved by forgiving student debt.
Right.
And according to Carolyn Morris from Earnest, I think that's the website, in February of 2023, she provides many underlying issues regarding the rise of tuition increases. She states, over the last 30 years, which is a very good place to look at, considering that it's increased 700% since 1963 or 67. Tuition costs have soared for a variety of reasons. State funding cuts, expanding administrative staff, and increased construction and facility costs all play a role. As a result, the average student debt among college graduates is now close to $28,000. Administrative positions are growing. Marketing to prospective students, the student experience like rock climbing walls, cafeterias, football teams, gyms, facility, that real bougie Olympic-sized swimming pool, yeah, that's all going in your tuition. Additional student services. In 2011, colleges and universities collectively spent more than $11 billion on new facilities and simultaneously amassed $205 billion in debt. Now that's according to figures reported by the Hechinger report?
Hechinger.
Yeah, Hechinger. And additionally, according to the recent interview with New York Times finance columnist Ron Leiber, he discusses how colleges adjust their prices not as a means of balancing the budget, but as a means of perception. Some colleges have artificially raised their prices to appear more elite, while simultaneously increasing their endowment and merit-based aid. This creates the illusion of steep discounts. Both tactics attract students and often cost them more in the long run. Even worse is the fact that state governments have slashed education funding, forcing students to foot more of the bill through loans. So more facilities increasing your tuition. For perception, we are making your college more expensive.
We're literally just going to make it cost more and then give you a discount. This is why I'm always amused by like these articles that say this high school student got $7 million in scholarships. No, they didn't, right? They got a bunch of schools who artificially inflated their costs to waive some of that imaginary money. But I
10% discount.
Yeah, but I digress. Go ahead.
Yeah, so and that's an issue. And lastly, it's the state funding is getting slashed, which is what we're going to go to right now. And it's another big issue that can be addressed directly, is the fact that during the Great Recession in 2008, the government began slashing spending. And one of those things include college education. A 538 analysis examined this action and reported some numbers in 2018. A professor, Doug Weber of Temple University, he stated that the biggest factor behind rising tuition might have more to do with the state funding than any individual school's spending habits. In the wake of the Great Recession in 2008, governments scrambled to slash state spending on a number of line items, including college education, as they saw it might have not been important, I guess. Between 2008 and 2018, public funding for higher education was reduced by a hefty $6.6 billion, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a Washington, D.C. based research institution. What exactly does that look like per student? Let's take Pennsylvania, for example. Between 2000 and 2016, state spending on higher education was cut by about $6,000 per full-time student. That amount, Weber argues, was almost certainly tacked on to the cost of tuition. So one potential argument is that debt forgiveness is effectively subsidizing unwise decisions by various states that have chosen to de-invest in higher education, effectively letting them freeload on taxpayers in other states that have made wiser decisions.
Now, a somewhat related point here is that debt forgiveness is just going to continue the process of artificially inflating the credentials that you need to get a job. This is the common phenomenon of credential inflation, or what we might say devaluing the actual meaningful value of a degree. So the Foundation for Economic Education in December 2021 talked about the decreasing value of a college degree. They say, today nearly 40% of all Americans hold a four-year degree. Much of the evidence seems to suggest that this has not actually increased their purchasing power. Like the value of a college degree has gone down due to the vast increase in the number of workers who possess the degree. And the basic argument here is that we as an economy have started building in college degrees as requirements for things that don't actually require 4 years and thousands of dollars worth of training. It's seen as sort of like a signaling thing, a marker that you are a smart person who can hand in assignments on time, but it's a marker that costs you, 6 figures to obtain, which is kind of ridiculous. Do you need a bachelor's degree to do most computer programming or to work in most basic basic office jobs? The answer is probably no. But we have created this credential culture where we view anybody who doesn't have at least a bachelor's degree as not worthy of a professional type job. And here again, not only does debt forgiveness not solve this problem, it arguably makes it worse. And that actually leads to another important point, and this is the idea that debt forgiveness solves nothing, it only exacerbates the problems that we've just talked about with Tanner as kind of a running theme. If you think about it, look, if you have a spending problem, which we do in this country when it comes to education, and your parents come along and say, okay, we will bail you out and we will pay off all of your credit card debt, does that make it more likely that you'll be fiscally responsible in the future or less? I would say the answer is less. Bailing people out makes them less responsible, not more, because it gives them this idea that there's this magical pool of money that might just come along and save them the next time if things get out of hand. And the reason why colleges and universities are building these massive rec centers and these luxurious dorms and paying 10 deputy assistant deans for cultural enrichment each, a six-figure salary, is because, I hope I don't get fired for this. I hope the deputy assistant deans don't come after me. But the reason they're doing this is because they've had this endless pool of federal money in the form of student loans, this seemingly endless pipeline of cash with students and parents who will basically pay whatever because you got to have a college degree to get a job, right? And if Uncle Sam comes along and just wipes away all that debt, the messages it sends to all these people is, you were right. You know, you did the right thing. Colleges, you were right to go all in on this ludicrous spending spree and increase your cost eightfold. You thought there would be no consequences, and in fact there weren't, right? And students and parents, you were right to look for more cost-conscious options because, hey, you ended up getting it all forgiven anyway. Congratulations, there was an endless pool of money after all. And when you say that to people, what do you think the next generation is going to do? What incentive is it going to create? It certainly isn't going to create an incentive to tighten up the old belt and lower the cost. If anything, it's going to create an incentive to keep jacking up the prices because, look, sky's the limit, boys. Uncle Sam's paying the tab. And in economic terms, this is what we call a moral hazard, which is just a term that means creating an incentive for future irresponsible actions. There's a very good article on this as it relates to student debt relief by Robert Farrington in Forbes in 2019, which I will not quote due to time, but we will post a link, and I definitely encourage you to read it because it's a very strong intuitive argument about how forgiveness of student debts is fundamentally in tension with the long-term solutions, which actually helps to turn a lot of the pro-impacts 180 degrees by saying it's just going to make them worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, last but not least, we have what probably will be the major point of contention for many con teams, which is that other options are better. I mean, literally anything else would be better than just, giving out a blank check. So like we said earlier, one major downside for the pro is being locked into a single, very absolute policy that doesn't do much, if anything, to address forward-looking concerns. All it does is address, past debts and doesn't create any systemic reforms whatsoever. But what's bad for pro is great for con, and as it gives the con teams tons of leeway to run counter advocacies or counter plans. One thing to address up front here is the question of whether counter plans are acceptable in PF. And it kind of depends on where you're debating and who's judging you. As you probably know, the NSDA rules for PF forbid both plans and counter plans, which the rules define as a, quote, formalized, comprehensive proposal for implementation. However, the rules allow both sides to offer a, quote, generalized practical solution. Frankly, I think this rule is nonsense,
right.
But some circuits and judges think it's important, so let them have that. So what I normally tell debaters is, since this rule applies equally to both sides, the pro and the con, that suggests that the con can offer counter proposals as long as they're no more comprehensive and formalized than what the pro is offering. So if the pro is allowed to say we should not give, or we should forgive all student debt today, the con should be allowed to say, for example, no, we should only forgive debt for students below a certain income threshold,
right,
or something similar. And usually, as long as you don't explicitly call it a counterplan, maybe an alternative or a counter advocacy, whatever terming you couch it in, I find that teams are typically just fine proposing alternate approaches. So with that out of the way, what are some of the better alternatives? Well, first, we should remember that loan forgiveness is no different than any form of federal spending. Larry Summers, the Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton, expressed his concerns on loan forgiveness in 2022, saying every dollar spent on student loan relief is a dollar that could have gone to support those who don't get the opportunity to go to college. Student loan debt relief is spending that raises demand and increases inflation. It consumes resources that could be better used helping those who did not, for whatever reasons, have the chance to attend college. So to be clear, this is money that the federal government was entitled to, that it could have collected and spent on other needs, but chose to forego. And so in practical terms, this is no different from spending. So what would be some better ways to spend this $1.7 trillion? Well, for one, more Pell Grants. Most people want others to have the opportunity to go to college and get a higher education. Getting a higher education is something that many parents want for their kids and what many bosses want for their employees. The truth is that college is a positive thing for young people's future. Therefore, as the con, recognize this and make the room know that you are not against people going to school, but rather you want more people that do not have the same opportunity as others to be able to pay for this college. Therefore, an effective way of doing this is already seen in the status quo, and that is the distribution of Pell Grants. And one thing to note here, this is a progressive policy. This is moving forward. This is not reckoning or dealing with the debts of other...
Well, it's progressive in both sense that it goes forward and also that it goes to the most needy people.
Right, right. And according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in July of 2017, they write, for 45 years, the federal Pell Grant program has been the cornerstone of financial assistance for students from low, moderate income families, helping millions go to college. Pell has been, by far, the single largest source of grants for post-secondary education, expanding college access and economic opportunity over the past 40 years. Last year alone, academic year 2015 to 2016, Pell provided more than $28.5 billion to support 7.7 million students, or nearly 40% of all undergrad students.
Imagine what you could do with $1.7 trillion in
right,
comparison to that amount, right?
Right. Furthermore, the same source discusses their success, but even though they are successful, the lack of funding prevents more Pell Grants to go to deserving students. Despite their proven success, however, Pell Grants now cover a small and shrinking share of college costs for students who receive them. That's true whether you compare Pell Grants to rising tuition and fees, or you add room and board or whatever. Today, Pell covers just 29% of the average cost of tuition, fees, room and board, and for four-year public colleges. Its lowest level in more than 40 years and far below the 79% it covered in 1975. So using the money to shore up Pell Grants, expand how much they award, expand who is eligible for them, these would all be common sense alternatives that address the cost of college education, have perspective as opposed to purely retrospective benefits, and are focused on those who truly need them.
Right, and another alternative would be to lower interest rates to these loans. The main reasons why these loans are being given is because when the loan is given out to the student, there is an interest rate associated with the principal amount. The higher the interest rate, the more money the lender will get compared to that of a lower interest rate. According to the USA Today in August of 2023, they stated that the average federal student loan interest rate is approximately 6.87%. Additionally, according to Liz Welding from bestcolleges.com, she gives a data summary of how long loans typically take to pay off, along with who generally has them as of September of 2023. She stated that student loans can take 5 to 20 years or longer to repay. So that's a lot of time to have that interest build up. It would take the average bachelor's degree graduate about 10 years to pay off their student loan debt payments of $300 a month. This interest tags on extra money that borrowers have to pay. Therefore, having a nearly 7% interest rate results in a lot of extra money being paid back to the initial principal amount. In addition, it takes borrowers 5 to 20 years or longer to pay back, which means if it takes them 10 years to pay it off, they will be paying 68.7% of the principal amount back to the lender.
And actually, I would tell you that the way compound interest works, it'll actually be even more than that. It's not 6.87 times 10, it's 6.87 and then 6.87, of more than that. So if you add it all up, it's actually more than 68.7%. You can easily, I'll just say this from experience, end up, if you go slow with it, paying like more, even if you're paying it down, you can pay more than double the amount you borrowed very, very easily on a student loan if you're not paying it off like on a 10-year plan. So.
Right, and this interest is hurting a lot of people in regards to paying back student loans, and absolutely is setting them back, especially with the people that are doing 10 years, 25 years, and so on, especially younger people trying to get jobs. So that's the amount of money that's typically being taken out. This is a huge increase in what needs to be paid back. So if we just got $1.7 trillion just laying around, why not lower or eliminate the interest rate, which helps both existing borrowers and future borrowers? as opposed to only those debts in the status quo.
Yeah, so I've got one last alternative. This is kind of a technical term here, but it is literally anything other than all student debt. That's what I have it tagged as. The last, and I think for me, most effective alternative is just to say, Judge, look, even if you agree that a lot of student debt should be eliminated, do you really agree that all of it should be paid for by taxpayers? Because that's what's happening here. What about student loans held by lawyers and doctors or kids who just graduated from Ivy League schools and are starting their Wall Street consulting job or their job with McKinsey or their job with a big law firm? Do you think really that we should be spending $40,000 in federal money to basically make it a little bit easier, take away some monthly payments for somebody who's in their 20s making $200,000 a year at one of these jobs? Knowing that we could take the same amount of money and put it toward things like we just said, like Pell Grants for the truly needy, or lowering interest rates, or heck, things that are totally outside of higher education, grants for technical education for people who want to be electricians, plumbers, help them, give them loans to go buy their tools and their trucks and things like that. If you said no, I don't think we should take that $40,000 and give it to the 28-year-old who's living high on the hog in their Wall Street job, then congratulations, Judge, you have just rejected the most important word in the resolution, which is all. And if you look at any of the real world proposals that are out there, they're smart enough to know that all should not be in the proposal here. None of the real world proposals that we look at call for a flat across the board total forgiveness. All of them call for more limited, targeted relief for people who actually need it, not wealthy young professionals. And from there, you can maybe list a couple of options. The Biden plan, for example, would forgive up to $20,000 in debt, not all of it, right? The Elizabeth Warren plan would forgive even more, up to $50,000 of debt for the 95% of borrowers who are the least wealthy. And you can say, Judge, if you think the richest 5% of student debt holders with high six-figure incomes should pay even a portion of their debt, as the Warren plan does, then you should reject the absolute position of the resolution, reject the word all, and vote in favor of a more moderate, need-based proposal. So that was a lot. I think there's a lot of strong arguments on the con. I think it would be more fun to argue on the con. I don't know if they still do coin flips anywhere out there, but if they do, get good at flipping coins and take the con.
Get a weighted coin.
Yeah.
Right, get a weighted coin or maybe put some kind of bug or something in Siri to we thought about doing that here, but that's cheating, so don't do that. But that's it for the con, so let us quickly take a quick break, come back and do some final thoughts. Let's do some final thoughts at record-breaking speed. Tanner, go.
Absolutely. I got 3 things for you. 1, focus on the word all. That makes this resolution really lopsided. 2, I'm really sorry, but focus on your strong suits. Put some solid numbers out there. Go on financial stimulus, racial and gender equity. And 3, con, sit back, throw back your arguments, but sound professional.
Yeah, that's really good. So I have very similar arguments. On the pro, when you're talking about stimulus, focus on those absolute numbers. Focus on billions of dollars added to the economy, reductions in unemployment, things like that. Those give you a fighting chance. Those sound impressive, and they give you a fighting chance on the AF. Also, I would agree with Tanner, have good arguments about equity. I think in particular the racial equity argument and the racial wealth gaps give you kind of a strong emotional and moral argument that like halfway solutions aren't sufficient here. It shouldn't be just about money. It should be about things like justice. That also gives you a fighting chance. On the con, you have a lot of good options. I won't tell you what to run there. You have plenty of choices, but I would say on both sides, sound like an adult, sound like you know what you're talking about. If you don't know how something actually works in the real world, find out before you go into the round shooting your mouth off, because there's a very, very good chance that your judge will know about it from personal experience, and you don't want to be the side that sort of sounds foolish because you don't really understand the realities of how this works. Devin.
Be on the con. Work on intimidation, go to the gym, get big, work out. If you know someone in the tab room, slip them some money every now and then. Try to get them on your good side. Just do whatever you can not to find yourself on the pro side.
So is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't disagree with any of that. That's probably true. So we've had a lot of fun making this video. We hope it's really useful to you. We hope you guys have a great time in November and December on this topic. I'm sure you will find ways to make it more balanced maybe than we could in our limited research. So until then, just remember, debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hail state.